Hello, my name is Hwansan Sunim, and this is SEON Meditation in English. So, whatever we're doing, whatever is on our minds, let's put all of that stuff down and let's enter into guided meditation together right now. And let's focus exclusively and completely on our meditation practice for the next 45 minutes or so. In today's program, we will be dealing most directly, thus far, with the Buddha's teachings, his prescriptions on how to lead a wise and compassionate and joyful life, and his analysis and proposed solutions for the kinds of issues and challenges that we have to face in trying to achieve that goal of leading a wise and compassionate and joyful life. The topic of today's contemplation and meditation is the reality of impermanence, the reality of human mortality, the fact that every single one of us, without exception, must inevitably one day die. Now, this is an extremely uncomfortable topic for many people. When I look around me, I think that many, if not most of the modern societies in this world make a very deliberate, intense, and organized effort to conceal the signs of impermanence, to hide away evidence of our mortality. And we can see this around us. For example, we hide the signs of our physical aging behind cosmetic products, makeup and hair dyes and clothes that flatter us. And most people in modern societies are very, very uncomfortable with the topic of disease. Many people think of disease as an intrusion, as an interruption, as almost an attack on their lives, as an invasion of their bodies, and they just want to go back to the natural course of their lives. Very few people, when they get sick, think that this is a natural event, that this is a natural consequence of life itself, that when the body ages, our immune system weakens, and that has caught them off guard, and they needed to get it out of their way so that they can return back to the life that they feel entitled to. And even more so than aging and sickness, probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, taboo in modern society is death. We are in amazing denial of death. And I'll give you an example of that. I'll give you my personal example. In my case, I was born and raised in the modern West, and I spent most of my adult life in Korea. And it wasn't until after I was already an adult, it wasn't until after I had already become a Buddhist monastic, that I saw a corpse for the first time, a dead body, when I performed my first funeral ceremony. And then I realized that this had been completely hidden from me. And as I looked around, I really began to sense this amazing denial of the reality of death that we live in the midst of. That's how uncomfortable with the signs of impermanence we are. Now the problem is that when we try to conceal the signs of impermanence, whether we fully realize it or not, we are in a sense choosing to live a life in delusion. When we turn our face away from this most basic feature of the reality that we live in, whether we want to admit it or not, whether we're fully conscious of it or not, in a sense, we begin living a lie. And the consequences of that, of living a lie, of living in denial, are unfortunate at best and probably tragic at worst. Many, if not most of us, want the things that we like, the things that we cherish and adore and love, to last forever. And we want the things that we dislike, the things that we abhor and even loathe, to go away right away. Because when we engage in thinking like that, thinking that is so at odds with the real nature of the world around us, we begin to suffer. When you hold an emotional posture like that, when you think of the world and think of your life in those terms, wanting only the things that you like to stick around and wanting all the things that you don't like to disappear, if you really ingrain that kind of thinking into your consciousness, it will begin to feel like the world is acting against your wishes. The world is denying your desires. The world is something that has to be fought against and struggled through. It'll feel like the world is against you in a world. It'll feel like life is against you. And so we say things like, well, that's the way the world is, or, that's life. Not really realizing that it's not life and it's not the world, it's a product of our dysfunctional thinking. So from the Buddhist perspective, it's considered wise to try to see the world as it really is and base our decisions and choices and actions and way of living on that reality. It's common sense, but it's not always easy to follow common sense. I guess our emotions get in the way. So the Buddhists have attempted to do this and sort of systematize their observations of the world. And what they've kind of come up with in summary form is that that the world is the basic characteristic, the most fundamental, essential characteristic of the world is impermanence. And impermanence means change, unceasing, unstoppable change. It's always changing. The world, the physical structures of the world may seem very solid. Our own bodies may seem very solid. And when we look in the mirror from day to day, we don't seem to be changing much. But the truth is that the world is very fluid and it's constantly changing. But the Buddhists also observe that this change is not chaotic and unpredictable. That change in the universe follows a kind of pattern, a characteristic pattern of 4 stages or 4 steps or 4 phases or however you want to put it. And this pattern of change pertains to all things in the universe, not only the material universe that seems to surround us, but even our internal mental universe, even the content of our minds, our internal mental events follow this pattern of change, this 4-fold pattern of change. And that pattern of change is as follows. All things, whether mental or physical, are said to have, in the first stage, are said to arise. They come into existence, they appear. And they assume a certain form or structure. And within that form or structure, they stay that way for a while. And so they are said to abide. They arise and then they abide. And then when time has passed, they go into the 3rd stage, which is it starts to fall apart. And that's called the phase of disintegration. And finally, whatever it is that we're talking about has fallen apart so much that its original form or structure is no longer recognizable, in which time it is said to have disappeared. So there is arisal, abiding, disintegration, and disappearance. Now, even, as I mentioned, even the events within our minds follow this pattern. So our thoughts, our emotions, our memories, mental imagery, anything that happens in our head is said to follow this pattern. It will go away, it will form on its own, and it will go away on its own. So our thoughts, our mental events are said to arise, and then they abide, and then they fade away, and then they disappear. Physical structures, the material world, the structures of the physical world are said to come into formation, and then they abide, and then they disintegrate or deteriorate, and then they finally disappear. And then our physical bodies also follow this pattern of change. Our physical lives, our bodies are born, they assume the adult mature form, and then they age, and then they get sick or they're somehow damaged, and then finally our bodies die. So this is neither good nor bad. This is simply the way things are. And the way things are within the Buddhist tradition, the most important thing about the way things are is that everything is impermanent. Everything will go through this fourfold pattern of change and then renew itself. The elements that make up the material world, the internal world, will come together, hold that way, fall apart, and then they'll come together in a different form. And so there's this endless cycle of creation and destruction, birth, death, and rebirth. Now for us ordinary human beings, the greatest challenge of our lives is to come to terms with the reality of impermanence. And according to Buddhist teachings, the extent to which we can come to terms with this universal condition of impermanence will determine how happy or unhappy we become, how wise or foolish we become, and how helpful or harmful to others in the world we become. Now, within the Buddhist tradition, the wisest example of a response to the reality of impermanence is said to be seen in the life of the Buddha himself. So what I would like to do now is share with you the story of the early life of the Buddha. The Buddha is said to have been born a prince about 2,500 years ago. Currently, scholars date his birth at around 486 BCE. And he was born in a small kingdom. Within traditional accounts, it's called Kapilavastu, and it's located in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains in what is now Nepal. And his father was a king, and historians now say that he was an elected monarch, but traditional accounts tell us he was a king. The king's name was Suddhodana, King Suddhodana, and he had a wife, Queen Maya. And the two of them had gone for years without being able to have children, to produce an heir. And then one night, Queen Maya had a dream, and in the dream, a white elephant appeared with 6 tusks and entered the side of her body. And in Buddhism, a white elephant, is a symbol of the bodhisattva, a being who is made a vow to become a Buddha, a being who is destined to become a Buddha, an enlightened sage who introduces into the world the teaching of liberation from the cycle of birth and death. And he is said to turn the wheel, the universal wheel of the Dharma. So she had this dream of the elephant entering the side of her body, and when she woke up, she realized that she was pregnant. And as the pregnancy came to term, she, in accordance with the customs of her country, she embarked on a journey back to her father's home to have the baby there. And the legendary accounts, the traditional accounts tell us that on the way, her baby was born in Lumbini Garden. And this baby was named Siddhartha, which originally means the one who achieves his aim. So it's Siddhartha Gautama, Gautama being the family name. And tragically, Queen Maya died a week after Prince Siddhartha was born. And he was raised instead by his aunt, a woman named Mahapajapati. Now, after his birth, in accordance with the customs of their country, King Suddhodana called the seers to examine his princely son. And among them, the great and famous seer Asita made a close examination of Prince Siddhartha. And then he prophesied, Prince Siddhartha will become one of 2 things. Either he will grow up to become a great king and unite the Indian subcontinent and usher in an unprecedented period of peace and progress. And that type of king in that tradition was called a Chakravartin. So he would become a great secular ruler, or he will renounce the material world, renounce the secular goals, and he would become a great enlightened sage and introduce into the world a teaching by which we can save ourselves from the ocean of suffering. So he made this prophecy, and King Suddhodana made up his mind that he really wanted his son to become a great king. And so he arranged for his son to live in the most privileged, luxurious, sheltered circumstances possible. He lived always within palace walls. There were many palaces built for him to pass the seasons in. He was surrounded by young, beautiful companions and palace maidens. He wore the finest clothes. He ate the best food, and he was completely cut off from the world and completely unaware of the distress and misery of ordinary life out in the world. And this is how he grew up. This is what he thought the world was. And at the age of 16, he was arranged to be married to a woman named Princess Yashodhara, who was also from the same country as his mother. And the two of them had a son named Rahula. And the years passed, and he continued to live in this idyllic, sheltered, privileged existence until the age of 29. And then traditional accounts tell us at the age of 29, he decided that he wanted to kind of go outside the palace gates and see the country that he was destined to rule. So he called his charioteer, a man named Chana, and one day they went out through the gates together. And he went out into the city that surrounded his palace, and he saw, out in the city, he saw a very elderly man, an old man, bent over, quivering, infirm, suffering the ravages of age. And Siddhartha had never seen anyone like that before. He had always been surrounded by young and healthy companions. So he asked Chana, he said, what is that? And he said, that's an old man. And Prince Siddhartha said, well, what happened to him? And he says, he's grown old, he has aged. And Siddhartha said, well, does that happen to everyone? And Chana said, yes, that happens to everyone. And then Prince Siddhartha asked, well, will that happen to me too? And Chana said, yes, although you are prince, destined to rule our country, you will age too, you will grow old too. So with that, the two of them returned back into the palace, and Siddhartha was greatly distressed. He had no idea that this would happen to him. And then the story tells us that again, they went out on an excursion outside of the palace. And they went out there, and this time they saw a very sick person. Almost like what you think of as a leper, really just suffering the misery of untended disease. He was clearly not in a good state. And Siddhartha saw this and was horrified. And he says, what is that? And Chana again answered, that is a sick man. He said, well, what's wrong with him? And Chana said, well, he has a disease. He says, in this world, as we age, we eventually get sick. And again, Siddhartha asked, well, does that happen to everyone? And again, Chana replied, yes. And again, Siddhartha asked, will that happen to me too? And Chana said, yes. Although you're prince, although you're young and healthy now, eventually you too will get sick. And so again, Siddhartha fell into a kind of funk, and they returned back to the palace, and he had trouble sleeping, and he contemplated what he had seen, what he had never been told of. And then they went on a third excursion outside of the city, Chana and Siddhartha. And as they went out there, a funeral procession crossed their path. And as he watched them pass, he saw that they were carrying a corpse. And he said, what is that? And he said, well, that's a corpse. That's a dead body. And Siddhartha said, the dead body of a person, that was a person? And Chana said, yes. Life is given to us and then it's taken from us. And so, and that's called death. And so Siddhartha once again asked, well, will that happen to me too? And Chana once again answered, yes, it will happen to you too. It will happen to everyone. No one can avoid it. So they went back to the palace. And the story goes that Prince Siddhartha was greatly distressed. He didn't know what to do. He had been confronted with realities that nothing he had any power against. His princely title, his wealth, his power, his youth, his health, his intelligence, his abilities, none of it could prevent him, he realized, from getting old, getting sick, and finally dying. And so he didn't quite know what to do. And then for whatever reason, they went on a fourth excursion outside of the palace. And this time, Prince Siddhartha and Channa saw a wandering ascetic, which was called in India a samana, a person, a spiritual practitioner who had given up all of their material possessions and titles, renounced all secular aims, and carried around, almost half naked, carrying around an alms-begging bowl and seeking liberation from the cycle of suffering, seeking enlightenment. So Siddhartha had never seen anyone like that before, and so he asked, who is that man? And Channa said, well, that is a samana, and he seeks liberation from the cycle of suffering. And Siddhartha, that was completely new to him. He said, and then that offered to him his first ray of hope since seeing the terrible sights that he had seen in the city. And he says, so that's actually considered possible. And then he went back again into his palace. And now he had a lot to think about. And he had to process everything that he had seen. And he thought, well, he realized that as fortunate as he may have seemed, that the comfort and happiness and sort of peacefulness that he was enjoying now was built on an unreliable foundation. That the conditions which created his present unhappiness would change in time, that they would betray him. Of all the things, the most important thing was that his body would age. It would get sick and it would die. So no matter what that body owns or enjoys, it won't matter, because the vehicle itself falls apart. And he realized that the entire universe is like that nothing in the outer universe fails to follow that rule of impermanence, that everything kind of deteriorates and breaks apart. And so then he began to understand the path that the samana had taken, that if the outer world offers no help in transcending the suffering of age, sickness, and death, then maybe the answer would lie within the inner world, within our consciousness, within our minds. And so, the story goes, he made up his mind. He decided to make a choice based on what he now knew of the universe. And so, he, in the middle of the night, he went to his sleeping wife and child and kissed them goodbye. And then he called his faithful charioteer, Channa, again, and together they left the palace for the last time. And they went into the forest, and there Prince Siddhartha sent Channa back to the palace, and according to traditional accounts, he cut off his own hair, and he traded his princely clothes with the rags of a bypassing beggar, and there he began his life as a samana, as a wandering ascetic, as a truth seeker. And as we know the ending of this story, and he went on to he succeeded in finding the path to enlightenment, to freedom from the suffering of birth and death. Now, when we look at this story, even in the story of the Buddha, we can see that the confrontation with the reality of impermanence is the first step to getting on the spiritual path, on any kind of authentic spiritual path. And it is considered, especially within Sun Buddhism, but within all forms of Buddhism, the most important step. It is considered absolutely critical that we see the nature of the universe and see the conditions of our lives. Because only when you see how things really are can you make an informed decision of what to do about it. So the becoming awakened to the reality of impermanence is considered really the most important step that we can possibly take. It is a step that puts us on the spiritual path, and it can be argued it is a step that marks the transition from being a child into being an adult, because you have to know where you are and what's going on before you can make your own decisions. And there's a story that illustrates the importance of realizing the urgency and the immediacy of the reality of impermanence. And the story goes like this. One day, the Buddha, Prince Siddhartha, now had become enlightened and was now the spiritual teacher, the Buddha, and he was with 3 of his disciples. And he said to the first disciple, "Tell me what you know of birth and death." And the first disciple answered, "We can die today." And the Buddha said, "You're not ready to practice." And then he asked the second disciple, "Tell me what you know of birth and death." And the second disciple said, "We can die in the course of a single meal." And again the Buddha responded, "You also are not ready to practice." And then he asked the third disciple, "Tell me what you know of birth and death." And the third disciple said, "If I breathe out and don't breathe in again, I will die." And the Buddha nodded affirmingly and said, "You are ready to begin this path." And he said, "Birth and death hang in the space of a breath." So this is how important the realization of impermanence is considered within Buddhism, that you can't really even begin your true life of meditation and spiritual cultivation until you have really, really understood and comprehended the reality of impermanence. Okay? So why don't we take a break here, and when we come back, we will continue on with this discussion of impermanence. And we're back. So when we hear this very famous story of the Buddha, his early life and his decision to begin his spiritual quest for enlightenment, it may be difficult if you're not already a seasoned Buddhist, someone who's already made a commitment to following the Buddhist religion. It may be difficult to try to connect this story to our own lives. The story takes place in another time and place. There are kings and queens and princes, and it's structured, kind of like a parable or a fairy tale, and it may seem a bit alien or distant from the realities of the day and age that we live in now. And what I would like to propose here is that instead of trying to wonder whether this is a historically true, a literally true story, a historically true story, and all of the incidents in this story are exactly true, instead of thinking of it in those terms, it might be more helpful for modern practitioners to look at it as a story of human growth, the evolution and development and growth of human consciousness. We may begin in a childlike state, sheltered, if we're very fortunate, sheltered from the troubles of the world, and then little by little, we begin to see that the world is not as comfortable and peaceful a place as we had hoped. Not only that, the conditions of our own personal existence, our own bodies, which we consider to be ourselves most of the time, even that is not entirely reliable, and this presents certain questions that we now have to face, which is the topic of today's program, the reality of impermanence. And what I would like to suggest today is that this is not a religious question. It's not about whether you believe in Buddhism or not. All religions, including Buddhism, are simply ways to describe what life really is and what it can be like. So really this story is about life, human life. How are we to live as human beings when we are placed in these circumstances of impermanence? And the Buddhist teachings very urgently warn us that to ignore this question can create great suffering in our lives. It's a very sad story, but basically many years ago when I was studying psychology in New York, I had a friend, a law student, someone who was studying in law school, and he was a wonderful person, and he was deeply, deeply committed to the cause of social justice. He was very active in working for marginalized communities and trying to defend their rights and so forth, and a person of great integrity and someone I admired personally. And so between his community activities and his law school studies, he was quite busy. And in the course of that, one day his father got sick and was examined in the hospital and was diagnosed with cancer. And this friend of mine tried to kind of take it in stride and continue living his life while attending to his father and his family, and they embarked on a year-long struggle with this disease. And there were ups and downs. Initially, there were very promising results from the various kinds of treatments and therapies that they used, and I think there was surgery. And there were times when they thought, well, okay, he's going to be okay, and then only to have a relapse, the cancer cells would start up again, and over time, it became evident that they wouldn't be able to save him. And the saddest thing was that this father, whom I was never actually able to meet, but I only heard the story from my friend, but this father was never able to come to terms with what he was facing. He experienced the greatest terror and grief and horror and physical misery. And he was just never able to kind of put down roots and find some way to get through it. And he fell deeper and deeper into despair, into panic, into horror. And this is how he left the world. There is no other ending to this story. This is this is where it ended. As long as we wish it wouldn't end like that, but he spent to the last minute, and to the last moment, he tried to deny and defy what was happening to him. But nonetheless, this was someone who had to face the reality of impermanence with really no preparation whatsoever. He didn't expect it. He was not ready for it, and he suffered very greatly for it. And it's when we hear a story like that, I think, at one time we may feel a sense of sympathy and so forth, and at the same time, it makes clear to us the enormity of the problem of human mortality. I mean, what can we do? Our bodies will age, they will get sick, and they will die, and there's simply nothing we can do about it. And so the natural response is simply to live today and try to forget what will happen on some tomorrow. Because even though the Buddhist warnings for us not to ignore this reality seem sensible, we simply don't know what to do in the face of this kind of, unstoppable reality, this unstoppable process of change and age. And it doesn't seem humanly possible that we could stand bravely against that kind of an onslaught, that kind of an attack on our physical existence. And so I would like to actually share another story with you of actually one of the most remarkable spiritual beings that I have ever met. And you may laugh at this, but actually this being was not human. He was actually a dog. And I was living in the meditation hall, several years ago, and it was in our monastery, Hwansan in Incheon. And in our monastery, as in many monasteries, there are a lot of stray animals that go through because the people in our community don't shoo them away. So there are a lot of stray cats and dogs that come through. And there was this little dog, this cute, really, really cute little dog. And he was very, affectionate and joyful and lively, and he really liked people. So the monks, the meditation monks, took an instant liking to him. And we were in winter retreat, so as the weather grew cold, we have near our main meditation hall a small kind of prefabricated structure. It's kind of like a small hut that we keep some exercise equipment in for the monks to come in and stretch out and exercise and so forth. And so the dog would go in there because it was warmer. And the monks were completely fine with that. So we had this kind of, four-legged guest with us in the course of the retreat. And as time passed, it became clear to us that this dog was sick. And it was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And there was a cloudy film that was beginning to cover his eyes. And so we realized it was going blind. He was going blind, and there was something wrong with him. And so originally the dog would go away for a while, then come back away for a while, but more and more he was kind of like cycling around that little house. And he was losing strength and energy and getting sicker and sicker. And so the monks were like, well, what should we do? And we kind of, kept an eye out over him. And eventually he became, quite sick. So, the monks made a little bed for him and gave him a little water bowl and a little food bowl. And just kind of kept watch over him. And, eventually this dog went completely blind. And so he couldn't go far away from his little bed. And he would just get up, eat, and drink a little bit, then go back to bed. And I would come down and stay with him during our off hours and just kind of watch, because this dog was amazing. When a person gets sick, they think of all that they're robbed of. All the entitlements that they feel about life have suddenly been taken away, and they feel offended, and they have their friends and family around them and doctors, hopefully. And there's a great drama that unfolds, and the human being has to go through a huge psychological process of letting go and coming to terms with what has happened to him, even though it's the most natural thing in the world. And when I looked at this dog, none of that was happening. It never whimpered, it never cried, it never barked. I tried to give it its space. I wouldn't go near it, very close to it, because it kind of looked like it wanted to be alone. But he was very quiet and very dignified. And I thought, he has none of his own kind with him. There are no other dogs around. There are only human beings who he can't properly communicate with. Completely alone in the world, without a home, without any kind of community or structure upholding his existence. He was dying alone and unnoticed, and he was okay with it. And it was just to witness this was one of the, I feel was one of the great spiritual teachings that were given to me in my life. And I am still to this day grateful for this display of courage and grace and wisdom in the face of mortality, in the face of death. So, eventually the dog, was almost completely immobile. And one day I came out during the break and I saw that he had been cleared away along with his bed and his bowls. So I thought he had died. And I raised a prayer hoping that he would go somewhere good. And I wasn't too worried. And because I thought I had really witnessed something amazing, and that he was so brave all the way to the end. So I didn't really feel sorry for him. I only thought, wow, if I could do the same when my time comes. And but actually what happened was, when the retreat ended, the dog came back. He survived. Somehow what I learned, I thought that he had simply been taken away, but he had been given over to someone's care. They had taken care of it, and it had somehow recovered. And the most amazing thing was, so I came out of the meditation hall, and it ran toward me, it knew me, it ran toward me and jumped into my arms. And it was still blind, completely blind. But it was, it was exactly the same way as it was before it got sick. It was joyful and vivacious and affectionate and really very beautiful. And, he seemed unscarred by his terrible experience, even though he was blind. And again, I thought, well, this has to be one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. But the reason why I tell this story here is because I have directly witnessed a living being able to face the reality of impermanence with great dignity and peace and stoicism. So it doesn't have to be all terror and misery. And this is a creature who hasn't been trained in Buddhism, who relied upon its natural resources. And the promise of Buddhism, the promise that Buddhism makes, is not simply that we'll be able to endure this painful process with dignity, but that we can transcend it, that we can reach a state of peace and knowledge and liberation that goes beyond the physical realm. Now, many people are uncomfortable with that kind of talk. They consider it mystical or overly religious and maybe not connected to their own lives. But I would like us to consider very carefully, if life is completely impermanent, if our bodies are fated to die, then we have to ask ourselves a question. It's only common sense to ask ourselves a question. When my body goes, do I cease to exist or do I not? And how we choose to answer that question will determine how we experience the rest of our lives. Because we don't have any evidence to say yes or no right now. We only have what we know and feel in our own hearts. And there are very few people who think that they're just a pile of molecules. So this question of survival beyond physical death isn't some superstitious question. It's a very natural question to ask, following on the heels of a very natural and logical realization of the truth of impermanence. And this is the question that we ask in meditation. What is this? What am I? And the claim in Buddhism is that if we can become enlightened to the thing that's asking, imoko, what is this? That thing within us, named Buddha nature in Buddhism, is something that will transcend the suffering of our physical birth and death. This is the promise that Buddhism makes and the invitation that it makes to try it out for ourselves. You don't have to believe it ahead of time. You just need to try it, and you just need to try it with the greatest sincerity possible. As a final note, what I'd like to say is that very often beginning meditators say that meditation is hard. My mind keeps wandering. I try to focus on imoko, on what is this, but I keep thinking of other things. I get distracted. And often the answer that many meditation teachers, including myself, give is that, you have to train yourself in the breathing and the posture and build your power of concentration, and then later you'll get better at it. But the actual true answer within traditional Buddhism, Buddhist teaching is that if we feel distracted in our meditation, if we feel our mind constantly wandering, it's because we're not taking it seriously enough. And the reason we're not taking it seriously enough is because we have not completely realized and accepted the truth of impermanence. If we knew how urgent the reality of impermanence was, our minds would not wander. It forced the Buddha to leave his palace. It forced my teacher's teacher, Sun Master Chungang, to go into an intense period of meditation that resulted in his enlightenment. It is the first step to real meditation and enlightenment. And so in closing, what I would like to ask and invite all of our viewers to consider is to consider this teaching of impermanence and ask ourselves in the most responsible way possible, considering that life is impermanent, that we have a very limited time in this world, on this planet, in this body. What am I to do? What am I to do with my life? What am I to do with the time that's given to me? It's only when we ask ourselves this question in the full knowledge of impermanence that we can begin a responsible adult life, and we can begin our spiritual path. So this is what I would like to leave with you, and consider once again the possibility that there could be a solution to this problem of endless suffering, of old age, sickness, and death. So thank you once again for participating in today's program. And once again, I will close with the traditional Buddhist greeting. May we all attain the Buddha. With 3 strikes of the Jukbi, we will enter our closing session of meditation.